welcome aboard, Captains, for another World of Warships video on my channel. Admiral Tori speaking, and today I am going to set sail with one of the most modern and finest carrier vessels of the Imperial Japanese Navy. These carriers, who will earn a legendary reputation throughout the Pacific theater from 1941 to the death of the Japanese Navy in 1944, are called the Shokaku-Class carriers. I hope you enjoyed this video, and without further ado, let's get into the specifications of the Shokaku-Class carriers. Number of ships in series: 2. Shokaku, the Soaring Crane. Lead ship of her class, built in Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, laid down on the 12th of December in 1937 and launched on the 1st of June in 1939. Zui Kaku, the Espouses Crane. Sister ship, built in Kawasaki Kobe Shipyard, laid down on the 25th of May in 1938 and launched on the 27th of November in 1939. Both carrier vessels commissioned prior to the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor of 1941. The Shokaku-class carriers are an enlarged variant of the Hiryu with extra modification to improve the overall performance. One major feature to note is that these carriers will be one of the first to be equipped with radar after the disaster at the Battle of Midway. Approximate displacement: normal load 29,800 tons, full load 32,000 tons. Dimensions: length 257.5 meters or 844 feet and 10 inches. Beam 26 meter or 85 feet and 4 inches. Draft 8.9 meters or 29 feet and 2 inches. Propulsion system: compound geared turbines. 8 boilers and 4 shafts producing a combined power of 160,000 horsepower that is capable of 34 knots top speed. The range of the Shokaku-class carriers can travel 7,581 miles at 18 knots with fuel capacity of 4,100 tons. Total complement of the crew aboard: 1,660 men. Anti-air and secondary defense armaments: heavy ordnance, 8x2 dual-purpose 127mm 40 caliber Type 89A1 and A1 Mod 2. Rate of fire: 8 to 14 rounds per minute. Muzzle velocity: 720 to 725 meters per second. Maximum firing range: 9,440 meters. Light ordnance: 32 by 1 AA guns 25mm 60 caliber Type 96 Mod 1 and 20 by 3 AA guns 25mm 60 caliber Type 96 Triple Mod 1. Rate of fire: 200 to 260 rounds per minute cyclic, but 110 rounds per minute is the effective rate of fire because of the recoil disrupting the accuracy. Muzzle velocity: 820 meters per second. Maximum firing range: 6,800 meters at 45 degrees with high explosive shells. One drawback of the 25mm AA is the limited 15 rounds box magazine for each gun. The combined AA ordnance weight in the ideal world is estimated at 13,551.2 kg or 29,898 pounds in 1 minute. These numbers will not reflect real-world scenarios. Note that the AA characteristics represented in the game Shokaku is not the World War II configuration because modification to both actual carriers throughout the course of the war. Aircrafts carried: 72 planes with 12 spares. In-game, only 72 planes are operational. Fighters: Kawanishi N1K5A. Torpedo bombers: Nakajima B6N. Bombers: Yokosuka D4Y2. The Shokaku-class carrier will practically participate in every major naval engagement in the Pacific theater except the crucial Battle of Midway, and relentlessly lose thousands of men for the duration of the war. Most known veteran IJN pilots are from the Shokaku-class carriers, which eventually diminished to the untrained recruits or kamikaze pilots by the ends of the war. The battles that the Shokaku-Class engaged are the attack on Pearl Harbor, the battle in the Indian Ocean, the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons Islands, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the Battle for Attu, Alaska, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Now, there have been many battles during the Pacific Warfare, and some of these battles are just part of the major battle. The battles listed that I have said are the major battles. The equivalent American counterpart to the Shokaku-Class carrier is the Yorktown-Class carriers. The expected class to succeed the Shokaku-Class carrier is the Taiho-Class carrier, which unfortunately did not live up to her name as the Shokaku did because of the late entrance to the war and poor damage control doctrine. Shokaku was sunk by USS Kavala by a torpedo in 1944, which is a submarine. Zuikaku was sunk by air in the Battle of the Cape Engano. This battle is only part of the major battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944. So, after going through all the details that I know about the Shokaku-Class carrier, what can I really conclude about her and how well does she play in World of Warship compared to the Lexington? The Shokaku. Now, there are many ships in World War II that I really do admire, and the Shokaku and the Zuikaku are undeniably one of those ships. And unfortunately, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, they are one of these ships that not many people know about or people who talk about, because most of the time, people like to talk about ships like the Iowa, the Yamato, or like the Queen Elizabeth class battleships, or ships that people see it and they know for a fact that they're known for something. For instance, the Iowa being one of the most powerful battleships in the United States Navy. It has served through many wars since World War II. The Yamato was known for being the largest battleship ever built to this day in terms of its dimension, and there's also the Bismarck during the Atlantic Warfare, and there's many other ships like the Enterprise. The Shokaku, the Japanese, one problem I have with the Japanese when it comes to researching Japanese ships is that the Imperial Japanese Navy doesn't really have a actual system or like a medal system where they actually reward pretty much the people who serve on these ships and give them a rating on what they have done throughout the war. The Shokaku-Class carriers, both the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, are undeniably one of the most biggest factor of why the Japanese were able to hold the Pacific War for all the way to 1945. I predict that if the Shokaku and the Zuikaku were not alive at that time, the Japanese would probably lost the Pacific in 1944 or 43. And the reason why is that the Shokaku and the Zuikaku were the only major carriers that were left after the Battle of Midway, because the Battle of Midway basically wiped out majority of the big carriers, or more like half the Japanese air power. And the Shokaku and Zuikaku were the only remaining strong actual carriers. The other carriers that the Japanese had, along with the Shokaku and Zuikaku, at that time weren't really capable of being a full-on carrier, because the Japanese tend to convert a lot of ships, and some of these ships, like passenger ships, were converted into aircraft carrier, while the Hiryu, the Soryu, and the Shokaku with the Zuikaku were built from keel up to be in actual carriers. So when those carriers get caught in the battle, they can most likely not survive a torpedo attack or a dive bomb attack. So they're extremely fragile, although the Shokaku also has some major flaws with their damage control. So yeah, the Shokaku and Zuikaku are actually, in my opinion, so far from what I've seen, are probably the most honorable and the highest recognizable ship from the Japanese Navy during World War II. And I cannot confirm that because, like I said, there's no real documentation that I can read from, because I find that Japanese carriers are the least documented, or Japanese ships in general, except the Yamato and some of the noticeable ships, but they are the least documented ships in World War II when it comes to researching, unless you're in a library that is dedicated to research. But on the internet, it's fairly difficult for me to find some actual information. Majority of the information tend to repeat, and they're very vague. So being vague is troublesome to make a conclusion on how confident I am about the Shokaku. but I do believe the Shokaku and the Zuikaku are probably the most honorable ships in World War II for the Japanese Navy. Now, for the American side, a lot of Americans, if you know your American ships, you know for a fact that the USS Enterprise, which is a Yorktown-class carrier, is the highest decorated American ship in World War II, earning 20 battle stars and enduring the entire war. The Shokaku almost endured the entire war, but it was the final battle at the Philippine Sea where both the carriers were sunk in succession. I think the Shokaku sunk first, and then the Zuikaku sunk second, which is basically the final battle where the Japanese Navy is completely obliterated until they reach the homeland of Japan, where the Americans torpedo bomb and dive bomb all the remaining ships, leaving the Japanese pretty much futile to any attack against the United States on sea, because the United States was just bomb the factory, bomb the dockyards, and you can't build any more ships, basically blockading the country until the ends of the war. So yeah, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, I would say the funny thing is that I said that the Shokaku counterpart is really the Yorktown class carriers, and these class of carriers come at a similar generation because both of these were built in the 1930s, right before World War II. And I find it really amazing how both of these carriers are known for what they have done, because in my opinion, the Yorktown class carriers were phenomenal during the early parts of the war. They done what they need to do in order to defend the United States. And same as the Shokaku and Zuikaku, although they were Axis power and people tend to disrespect or not even regard the Axis ship, mainly the Japanese, because they weren't considered Western, if you catch what I'm saying, because a lot of people, when it comes to writing history, it tends to lead to the Western side, which is why it's hard to find some information about the Japanese unless you're a dedicated researcher into this field. But yeah, the Shokaku and Zuikaku is up there with the Enterprise and the Yorktown and the Hornet during the war. They are pretty much the veterans. Basically, yeah, the veterans of World War II during the Pacific conflict. So that means, why isn't the Shokaku a premium ship? Because premium ships, World Warship picks premium ship based on their history, what they have contributed to the war, amazing stories, and all the good stuff that might be worthy as a premium ship. For example, the Tirpitz is a perfect example why it's a premium ship, because the Tirpitz is a Bismarck-class battleship. It was the only remaining Bismarck-class battleship and the most powerful ship in the Atlantic until near the end of the war. And the reason why the Tirpitz survived throughout the war was because they were trying to protect the Tirpitz for a long time. It was the pride of the German Navy, because after the Bismarck, the Bismarck was the largest class of battleships in the Atlantic, and they used the Bismarck in early parts of the war, and as a result, the Bismarck was sunk early in the war because they thought they were invincible. In a sense, not like entirely invincible. They were considering the options, they were considering some things, but there was a huge bounty on the Tirpitz and Bismarck, and the Bismarck got caught in a unfortunate situation where the Bismarck sank to the bottom of the sea. So the Tirpitz survived the war all the way to the near end before they were pretty much destroyed by the tall boy bombs. But yeah, the Tirpitz is a good example of a premium ship. Several other examples, like sooner or later it's going to be Enterprise. I'm pretty sure there's going to be Enterprise Premium. I can't really think of any other premium, like the Atago. Those Japanese cruisers has been doing a lot of things during the war, because the Atago was part of the Takao-class heavy cruisers, and the Takao-class certainly were considered very good cruisers at that time. But yeah, the Shokaku should have been a premium ship, and that is basically a freebie if you want to put in a collection. Now, although the Shokaku is not well known to many people, in general, to those people who play World Warships, they talk more about the Iowa, the Yamato, and all those bigger ships. The Shokaku sits in a special spot for me, basically, and I'm kind of happy that not many people know about the Shokaku, because I'm one of those few people who can actually share the stories about the ship, and it would be that wow factor when it comes to ships stories. And there are ships out there that everyone knows about, and not that wow factor anymore. So when I first found out about the Shokaku having this wow factor, I was very surprised at what she has done throughout the war, and especially the Japanese navies, because a lot of the Japanese ships has pretty much sunk throughout the war in a fast rate, in my opinion, from what I've seen. And seeing the Shokaku class carriers surviving the war for that long, and they had won the highest bounty because a lot of the Americans during World War II were searching for these two carriers. They wanted to sink these two carriers, and once they sink these two carriers, that pretty much crippled the Japanese Navy big time. But it took them a while into the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which the Zuikaku got caught in the battle in Gano near the Philippine Sea, and all the other good stuff about the Shokaku. So now, the bigger question, as great and mighty as the Shokaku sounds, why was the Shokaku not a premium ship? And to answer that is that there's actually a tier 8 carrier that was supposed to take the place of Shokaku, but they picked the Shokaku instead. And that carrier is a more reasonable choice, but they switched that out, which I will explain. The carrier that should have been tier 8 before the Japanese aircraft carrier line came out was the Akagi. The Akagi is in pretty much the exact same position as the Lexington, which is the tier 8 carrier on the American side. They both have a similar story in terms of where they come from, because both of them were battle cruisers converted into aircraft carriers due to the treaty, and they're pretty much one of the big carriers during World War II in the beginning of the battle, before the Essex-class carriers come out and all the other carriers that the Japanese converted from. But yeah, those two carriers should have been the two tier 8 in terms of the Akagi. Why did they take out the Akagi and put down the Shokaku? If you actually do some research, there's actually a video where they show the Akagi, which is why I know about it. But yeah, the Akagi, in the very early stages of War of the Warship, the Akagi was the determined carrier. So why did they replace it? Well, the Akagi, in my opinion, is one of the most badass looking carriers. That's number one. Number two, more people know about the Akagi than the Shokaku from what I've seen. Whenever someone mentioned about Japanese carriers, they mentioned the Akagi or the Kaga. And the reason why is that the Akagi, aside from looking like a badass, the Akagi is actually the flagship of the Navy at that time. Before it was sunk at Battle of Midway, it was the flagship of the Japanese Navy. Now, some would say that it would be the Yamato. The Yamato came later because, remember, the Yamato was a secret ship to the Americans. The Japanese were saying codes over and over, talking to the Yamato, and they were describing the Yamato. And it was later on to the war that the American realized that the secret project of the Yamato was revealed that it was the largest bound ship that the Japanese have ever built. And if the Americans knew that the Yamato was existing during the war and before the war, which is the time it was built, they probably would have sunk it right away. But yeah, the flagship for the Japanese Navy was the Akagi, and I'm assuming that Wargaming was going to put it as a premium rather than being the tier 8 ship on the line. So they placed it with the Shokaku. And the Shokaku is basically look like a Hiryu, but enlarged and pretty much improved over the Hiryu. So that was the carrier that should have been on the tier 8 slot, and they probably would have made Shokaku a premium ship. So now the next question. How well does the Shokaku performs in War of Warships? And this is quite painful for me to talk about because the gameplay I have, let's start with the gameplay. I have recorded gameplay. This gameplay comes from 0.5.5, which is around 4 weeks ago, before 0.5.6 that came out. So pretty much a month from this video that is being uploaded about this Shokaku-class carrier. And they've done some changes, so that old gameplay won't really reflect on today's, just slightly, because there was major buffs to anti-air on the battleships, so it's going to be more difficult to play the Shokaku and the Lexington. So in terms of gameplay, although it's all the amazing things I said about the Shokaku, how powerful she has been with her sister ship and what she has contributed, and all the veteran pilots that came from the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, it makes sense for the ship to be a powerful ship in World of Warships, and people will start talking about it. And that is pretty much deceiving, because the Shokaku on World of Warship is just decent. To me, it's just decent. There are some games that do really good with the Shokaku, and there's just games that I wish the Shokaku was a better ship. It's not to a point where the ship is just unplayable, but due to the fact that a lot of people don't like carriers in World of Warships and they're upset about how carriers are, the Shokaku doesn't really, expand on its power as much as it used to be. And as a result, I find it really difficult to play the Shokaku at times because the anti-air in the higher tiers really comes down to the higher tier games. I can find a really decent to good game when I get placed in a tier 6 to 8 game, but when I get placed to tier 6, tier 7 to 9, I start to struggle with the Shokaku. And when you go up to the higher tiers, there's more experienced players, so you're gonna expect more challenge. But the challenge is not the player. The player knows what he's doing. He turn on the anti-air defense, the defensive fire, and he start maneuvering against the torpedo bombers. Yeah, that is noticeably in the higher tiers because people have a brain when it comes to the higher tier matches normally because you are experiencing everything below the tiers. But the high tier, there is a huge anti-air atmosphere, and I can feel it with the Shokaku. The Shokaku, I run out of planes pretty often, and that's something that doesn't really happen with my tier 6 and tier 7 carrier gameplays when I was playing those carriers. And the reason why is that when I get placed in tier 7 to 10, basically, worst case scenario, tier 8 to 10, but tier 7 to 10 or 9, I can find a decent game, but I will do like pretty much 50 to 100k damage on average. When I get placed in a game where it's tier 8 to 10 only, it's practically impossible to find some result. And the reason why is that you're going against a Des Moines, a Baltimore, and those are American ships, but the Zao and the Ibuki have some considerable AA. You're going against a Zumo. Those large battleships, they have a lot of space to put AA on there. You're going against the Hindenburg and all these other cruisers, and cruisers tend to be one of the popular ships in the higher tiers. You're going against destroyers, and these destroyers are not slow like tier 3 or 2. They're like race cars speeding fast through the water, making it pretty difficult. And a lot of people who don't realize is that the torpedo damage for tier 8, 9, and 10 is exactly the same damage as the tier 4, 5, 6. So your torpedo damage doesn't change. The only difference is that your planes are faster, more durable, and you get more squadrons for the Japanese line. But aside from that, the torpedo damage is pretty much the same. And when you go against like a Iowa or a North Carolina or a Yamato, you gotta land at least like 10 torpedoes or something to do some damage, and when you try to land it, you only get like half your squadron shot down, and it's quite frustrating. It really frustrates me because wargaming, it's not an issue that I like to talk about because sometimes I don't really want to bother with issues because eventually at some point people will start talking about it and then the game company will fix it. But in this case, aircraft carriers for the Shokaku, I found that tier 8 in general is probably the most difficult tier to play carriers or try to get something going. Because tier 7, I didn't have that much of a problem. Sometimes I get placed in the high tiers that are ridiculous for a Hiryu or a Ranger, but I get placed in a reasonable match. Tier 8, you just get shot down. Your planes get obliterated, and I find it easier to play the Lexington than the Shokaku because the Lexington depends on dive bomber, while Shokaku, she sorely depends on her torpedo bombers, and to get torpedo bombers to work, you have to position them correctly, and you're going against players who are not that dumb about how torpedo bombers work, because if you show your broadside, that's an opening for a carrier player to go for you with torpedo. And I only got 4 torpedoes per squadrons, and you got defensive fire going off, and the plane's getting shot down really easily because anti-air just gets stronger and stronger and stronger as you go into higher tiers. Now this is way after back in the days when airplanes are barely shot down, but nowadays in this patch it's just difficult to find something going with the Shokaku, and the combination of having a limited supply of planes just makes me feel so useless. Now, although I sound pretty negative about how I feel about carriers at tier 8, it's not an entire loss. Like I said, I still enjoy playing the Shokaku at times. Sometimes I just feel like playing carriers and I just jump on the Shokaku. But at the moment, I'm starting to play less carriers because of the changes that have been made. Is leaning more toward the anti-air rather than doing some work on aircraft carriers. But yeah, the Shokaku, she certainly is a playable carrier. It's just that you're going to find much more difficult times of doing it. And also, you got to realize that the Shokaku doesn't have an increased size of planes, because the Hiryu has 72 planes and the Shokaku has 72 planes, which is pretty much the exact same carriers, but the Shokaku is a bigger carrier and has faster planes and more durable. But durability, although it's more durable than the previous tier, you're going against high tier ships, and those ships will just rip you to shreds. And you also have to consider the fact that it's high tier, not because the players are smart, but if you play in a high tier match, the enemy team or team you go against, half the time you're going against people who tend to sit at their side of the map, if you catch what I'm saying, meaning that you're gonna be more grouped up. And the last thing I need to know is that having trouble with one ship can get worse with going against a group of ships, because when you take a Shokaku or Lexington plane up against 3 ships grouped up, you won't get results at all. And even if you do, you probably hit 1 torpedo or 2 torpedoes, but that is not enough to kill the ship, because like I said, torpedo damage does not scale for the aircraft carriers, and dive bombers, you don't really want to depend on those for doing damage, because you need to do your torpedo damage first and then you follow up with the fire with the dive bomber. But if you can't flood the ship with torpedoes, then how are you gonna dive bomb the ship? So yeah, it's fairly difficult, and so far from what I've seen, I think tier 8 is the most difficult tier for a carrier player to enjoy. Tier 9 and tier 10, it seems to me that tier 9 and 10 is like the golden side of carriers, so I can understand why they want to put you in such a difficult position at tier 8. But tier 8, the way I feel is that the tier 8 carriers are just not ready for that type of anti-air, and not many people, think about how carriers operate. I get yelled at for not doing any good in the Shokaku, but like I said, I can't do anything against a team who's grouped up or against ships that have great AA or anything else. And you also have to consider the enemy carrier also. Just because I'm going against anti-air doesn't mean that I'm not going against other fighters. But yeah, the Shokaku, overall, I had to rate her as a decent ship. She's not a ship that's completely terrible, but she can be at times be difficult to play due to the fact that the way matchmaking plays you, or the players you go against, or how the game flows due to your luck. Aside from that, is there anything else I can say about the Shokaku? I definitely like the Shokaku overall as a ship, and she is definitely a beautiful ship. Just look at her, she's beautiful. But yeah, overall, I think she's still a ship that anyone could play, and I'm certainly gonna keep her. Now, aside from that, let's get into the gameplay that I recorded. Like I said, this is gameplay before 0.5.6 patch, which is the patch that they buff a lot of the high tier anti-air and the battleship anti-air also. So if you're watching this video and you're expecting some similar results as I did in that match, don't expect it at all, because your planes will be shot down much faster than before. But it's not that to the entire tent that you can't do anything. But yeah, I just feel like carriers need some work, honestly. So let's get in the match. Without further ado, let's see how the Shokaku plays. Alrighty guys, we are in the match with the Shokaku. Now the map I'm playing on, if I recall correctly, is the Land of Fire. So the first thing I do is to determine what planes to go out first. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't matter, but it pretty much depends on the player's preference. Now the first planes I send out is the torpedo bombers. In my Hiryu video, I send out the fighters first because I wanted them to scout for the enemy carrier's plane in terms of if they choose to strike me first. But with the Shokaku, I send out my torpedo bombers because I want to get the first strike first, and also over the recent patches, they have implemented the defensive fire on the carriers at tier 8 and above. So if the enemy chooses to do a double team full strike on me, I'll pop the defensive fire. Now if I'm not life during a situation, I wouldn't use the defensive fire, and also my fighter is trailing behind my torpedo bomber, so I can tell where they're coming from. So the first thing I do, I send my planes to the east side of the map because I'm looking for that destroyer. Now in this case, when it comes to high tiers, I usually strike destroyer first because they're the first one in the front lines to actually capture the flag, and the side of the map I picked was C because C is very popular with the smaller ship. Now that one destroyer, although it doesn't sound like a big target, I want to get rid of it right away because destroyers are pretty powerful in the higher tiers due to the fact that they have pretty good concealment, number one, and the torpedoes are extremely deadly. So I first send my torpedo bombers in, see if the destroyers there, and he's not there, but I did spot the enemy fighter. Now, I'm not sure what fighter that is. I'm assuming it's the enemy Shokaku, but it can also be the other carrier, which I don't recall correctly. It might be the Hiryu. So I go for a strafe, and this is a very good strafe because it was coming from the rear, and I was able to clear out most of the squadrons. Now I'm going to go engage the other fighter because I want to pretty much, I'm going to win the battle if the other fighter chooses to engage me. But I want to engage the other fighter right away because I want to clear as much fighters as possible and earn air superiority. Now watch out when you use strafe, because sometimes when you strafe you can actually friendly fire your own teammates, or you can friendly fire your own planes, which is bad. Now I'm going to double team this fighter, and I notice on the mini-map, if you look on the right corner, or the right side of the mini-map, you can see that the enemy torpedo bomber and dive bombers are going to sneak and try to go for a strike. Now at first I was assuming that he's going to go for that cruiser down there, but he does not. Now I spot the Fubuki, and what I do is I can split my force into two and try to pinch him in the corner. Now this tactic is called the anvil and hammer attack. It is a very classic strategy or tactic that is used in many warfares, and I really like using it on the Japanese carrier, which is one of the biggest advantages of playing Japanese carrier, is the ability to do the anvil and hammer attack, which pretty much guarantees a kill on a destroyer if pulled off correctly, and if the destroyer does not choose to do evasive maneuvers from the beginning, not mean that when the torpedo drop, but before the torpedo drops, because remember, torpedo bombers, you gotta position them before you can drop them, and if you can make it hard to position them, then you can minimize the damage and even dodge a anvil and hammer attack. Now I'm looking for the planes. That's my next priority because I don't want to die early in the match from the enemy carriers. But like I said, ever since they implemented the defensive fire, to this point, I feel like it is pretty useless to actually strike a carrier unless you have the friendly carrier on your team help you. But it doesn't really always guarantee the kill on the carrier. So I'm going to first try to strafe these torpedo bomber and dive bomber. And it will be a good strafe because they perfectly flying in a straight line. Timing it correctly, perfectly, I was able to get both the torpedo bomber and almost the dive bomber, but due to the fact that I used the strafe and fought the other fighter earlier, I ran out of ammo, so I couldn't do much against that dive bomber. Now I'm gonna send my other fighter. I don't think my other fighter can reach it in time, so I had to call my friendly carrier that if he has fighters nearby, which he does, to help me. Now this is only one torpedo bomber and only one plane from the dive bomber that can hit me. Now unfortunately the one dive bomber actually hits me because one dive bomber is pretty accurate on a Japanese carrier. It sets me on fire, but I don't damage control it right away. Some people have a very bad habit of panicking and pressing the button right away, but you want to wait because the torpedo bomber still has the capability of actually flooding. I slam on the brakes because I was hoping that he will overlead his torpedo strike. Sometimes people do that. I do it at the same time, and enemy carriers tend to be tricky. But I tried to be tricky, but in this case, it wasn't successful because he used the automatic drop. And with automatic drop, you can't really trick the computer because the computer knows that how fast you're going. It will always recalculate. And most time, automatic drop will get at least half the torpedo hits. So I damage controlled that torpedo bomb with the dive bomb hit. And I think the other torpedo one got wiped out by my friendly carrier, so I gotta give credit to him. Now I'm gonna try to resurface my plane, and I believe my dive bombers are somewhere. But usually you want to pick the right priority. When it comes to playing aircraft carriers, you want to make the right judgment. Should you worry about the enemy carrier attacking you first, or should you focus on a strike that you think you can get the strike with some result before you can get back to the carrier? And if you're really proficient in these skills, you can do both at the same time. And in my case, sometimes I'm very proficient and I can multitask very well, which some players don't do so well because it's not their type of game. But I didn't do so well when I first started playing carriers until I started to learn how to play carriers. And I started to have fun with the Japanese carriers because they're very fast paced and I find it fun. Now I see this Akagi, I'm going to go in with my dive bomber. And at this point, I feel like my rhythm of how my carrier strike is not in sync. And I'll explain why after I strike this Akagi. I will get at least 6 hits and 1 fire, which is unfortunate because I normally get at least 2 fires if I get more than 5 hits, or at least half the hits with my dive bombers. But in this case, RNG gave me only 1 fire. I'm gonna send my torpedo bomber in. Now I'm determining whether I should do an anvil and hammer attack or not, and in this case I will do it because the enemy is fairly grouped and the Colorado is coming at a tough angle. If I stack it on one side, the Akagi anti-air will help the Colorado take out my planes. So I decided that I'm going to split my squadron and I'm going to gamble it on each side. Now fortunately, the RNG on the anti-air for 0.5.5 did not kill my torpedo bomber squadron fast enough. So I was able to get a full strike in, and we're going to strike the Colorado from both sides. And that's one set, and the other set. Now he noticed that the Colorado is turned away from one of my torpedo bombers, but then he realized that the other side of the torpedo bomber will also strike him, giving me a devastating strike with 5 hits and 2 flooding. Now the Colorado in the chat will be in disbelief and believes I only hit him twice with 2 torpedo bombers, but I hit him 5 times, and that should be able to do like 40k or 30k damage. The reason why he died instantly, even though that was enough damage to do it, was because one of the friendly ships, I believe, one of the friendly battleship was able to citadel him half his health almost, giving me the kill because I got the last hit on him. He's still in disbelief. He's like, why? Helicarriers are able to land these much damage? And I'm like, Carrier's too strong because, you know, you got nerfed them more, even though these torpedo bombers do the exact same damage as the tier 4 Hosho. Now I spotted these torpedo bombers from the enemy carrier. He's gonna go trying to find his ship, and what I do is that I'm gonna take him out. Now he's not that smart about playing his planes, especially when you're playing Japanese carriers. If you're going against a difficult carrier player like me, because I'm pretty experienced in my opinion, you want to have fighters escorting your torpedo bombers, but if you're going against a least experienced players, you're better off just having your torpedo bombers doing your thing and having your fighter just scout the map and try to attack the enemy fighter or dive bomber or torpedo bomber. In this case, I just use my fighters flying around. There are games that I find it really difficult to deal with other carrier players because they are much smarter and I have to use my fighters to escort. And that's what you should really do with the Japanese carriers that use their fighter as escort when you play the strike package. But unfortunately, I can't do that as much as I want because my friendly team will see there's 2 fighters on the map and they're wondering why I'm using them to escort because, you know, the enemy fighter can engage my torpedo bomber and dive bomber, and the main purpose of a strike package is to do as much damage as possible, which is doable on the American carriers because most of the American carriers don't have fighters, so you don't have to worry about it. But with the Japanese carriers, your friendly team will most likely criticize you for not using your fighters to defend them, and you're pretty much playing the dual role, and sometimes you just don't do enough damage due to the fact that your friendly team wants you to escort them rather than you escorting your dive bombers or your torpedo bombers to do a nice run. And like I said, carriers, you know, it's pretty tough playing carriers if you don't do a correct run because it takes time to send your planes back and it takes time to actually refuel, rearm, get it back in the air, and in hopes of finding a lucky moment that the enemy ship is out of position. Now I tried to do a strafe on that dive bomber, but it was a big fail because I did it too early. When it comes to strafing, you want to do at a perfect timing because strafing increases the speed of your planes. So when your planes increases the speed at the front ends of the strafe at early on of the attack, you most likely will overrun the strafe and pretty much shoot one plane or no planes down. Now I'm going to go for this hipper, and I am pretty much guaranteed this kill because this hipper slows down and he's pretty much screwed because he's up against a lot of ship on the cap. And if you notice, my team are the smart ones because they capture all the flag. Now eventually in the game, you will notice that most of my ships will get sunk, and at one point the enemy team will have more ships than us, but fortunately we earned the early game advantage. I'm not sure why, but it seems to me that on World of Warship, players think that it's harder to capture a flag than to kill, because most games people want to kill than capture a flag, even though capturing the flag is the purpose of the domination game or standard battle. So for the enemy team case, they didn't bother to capture a flag, and some of their ships are in the position of what I would be, is that they try to make a attempt, and you might be that solo player who tries to capture a flag while your friendly team doesn't want to go in and escort you, and it kind of really sucks. And sometimes I get in that game, I really hate that game. That's the game I hate the most, is where you try to make an effort to capture a flag and stop the point from bleeding onto your team, but your team doesn't really react to escorting you and making an effort to capture a flag, which this team does not make that effort. Now I'm gonna send my fighters over there to engage those 2 fighters, and also my dive bombers in. Now back to the ribbon. I don't think I recall talking about the ribbon yet, but let's talk about the ribbon. The aircraft carrier rhythm is to have torpedo bombers first and then dive bombers, because your torpedo bombers will damage control the ship or force them to bait their damage control, because you're gonna make them flood, and nobody wants their ship flooding because flooding does a lot of damage. And after they damage control the flooding, you follow up with dive bombers in the hopes of doing 3 fires, which is pretty detrimental to your health. In this case, my ribbon is screwed up because I got only dive bombers up and no torpedo bombers up. So I want to do some damage and not wait. So what I did was I used my dive bombers first, and then I'm going to send my torpedo bombers later. Now, normally I want my dive bombers to go in last and torpedo bombers to go in first, because it's harder to get a run with a torpedo bomber than a dive bomber. So I use my torpedo bomber and bank that I get a flooding. If I don't get a flooding, I follow up with a dive bomber. Now, if I do get a flooding that is successful, then he will damage control. I set a fire, and if I set 3 to 4 fires, then it's almost guaranteed kill depending on the ship you're trying to kill. Now, if I did the reverse, which I tried to do back in the day when I started playing the IJN carriers, or in general when I started playing carriers, basically it's easier to use a dive bomber, and once I set the fire, you'll damage control it. But it's harder to set up a torpedo bomber run, so if I don't get the run correctly and get the flooding, then the run is not successful. Now in this case, I actually torpedo bomb his hipper, and the hipper makes the biggest mistake. He turns right with the direction of the torpedo bomber, and if you know the Japanese carriers, they tend to end up in the cone. So basically he shortened the width and allowed me to land many torpedo hits onto him. But yeah, back to the point. It's easier to get fires with dive bombers than flooding with torpedo bombers. So if you can't get the flooding correctly, then you can follow with dive bombers. But if you get the dive bomber correctly, it's fairly difficult to get the torpedo bombers hit, which is why most players prefer the torpedo bomb hit then follow up with dive bombers, because it's much more consistent, because all you have to do with the dive bomber is just aim that oval. With the torpedo bomber, you gotta come from the broadside, or you do an anvil and hammer attack. Now the enemy carrier decides to try to strike me. I turn on my defensive fire because the game is coming to an end, and I don't think the enemy carrier is capable of striking me and killing me again, so I might as well use my defensive fire. And also, you want to make an important note is that once you reach the 5-minute mark of the game, or 5 minutes left of the game, aircraft carriers aren't as effective as they expected to be, because the game is wrapping up, and the game takes a while for you to actually send your dive bombers over to the other side of the map. So here's the after action report. Aside from that, I hope you guys enjoyed this game, and I'll see you guys next time on World of Warships.